Imagine being dragged through the ashes of everything you've ever loved, your world reduced to smoke and screams, only to be handed like property to the very warrior whose blade ended your father's life. This is where Astrid's nightmare begins. Chained, broken, burning with a hatred so pure, it becomes the only thing keeping her alive. She makes a vow in that moment, whispered through tears and clenched teeth. She will make him pay. Not with a quick death. That would be mercy he doesn't deserve. No, she'll destroy him slowly, methodically, from the inside out until there's nothing left but the hollow shell of the monster who stole everything from her. But here's what she doesn't expect. The enemy has a face she can't quite hate the way she needs to. He prays to her God in the darkness. He weeps over graves only he can see. He carries guilt so crushing it's slowly killing him from within. And as winter closes in around their isolated existence, as secrets buried beneath floorboards begin to surface, Astrid discovers a truth more devastating than any she imagined. A conspiracy that reaches back before the raid, before her father's death, before any of them understood they were just pieces in a game played by men who treated lives like currency. Now she stands at an impossible crossroads, a blade hidden in her belt and her hand trembling against the ribs of the man who destroyed her world. And she can't make herself complete the killing stroke, because loving your enemy doesn't erase what they've done, but it might be the only thing powerful enough to break the cycle of violence that's already consumed everything else. The question is, when the final choice comes, when she must decide between vengeance and something she doesn't even have a name for yet, which will prove stronger? The sound of broken bells echoes through the burning abbey like a death knell carried on smoke and screams. Astrid's knees scrape against cold stone as rough hands drag her by the hair past bodies she recognizes. Sister Margaret with her rosary still clutched in stiffening fingers, young Cecilia face down in a pool of dark blood that reflects the orange glow of flames consuming the only home Astrid has ever known. The air tastes of ash and copper, thick enough to choke on, and somewhere beneath the crackling inferno she hears a sound that makes her stomach twist: laughter. Men laughing as they pile sacred texts onto pyres, as they rip golden chalices from the altar, as they decide which survivors are worth keeping. Her scalp burns where the warrior's fist grips her hair, forcing her head back at an angle that makes stars burst behind her eyes. Through the haze of pain and smoke, she sees him, the one they call the Demon King, seated on a throne made from splintered church pews, his beard braided with stolen silver, his eyes cold as winter fjords. He speaks in that harsh northern tongue, words like breaking ice, and the men around him roar approval. Astrid doesn't understand the language, but she understands the gesture when he points at her, then at the tallest warrior standing near the tent entrance, Leif Gunnarsson. She's heard his name whispered in terror even before the raid, seen the way other Vikings step aside when he passes. His face is a landscape of scars, his hands stained with what might be dried blood or dirt. She cannot tell and does not want to know. When the king speaks his name, something flickers across Leif's features, something that might be reluctance or disgust, but it vanishes before she can be certain. He nods once, a short, sharp movement, and the decision is made. She is a prize now, a trophy of conquest. "May the gods curse you," Astrid hears herself whisper in Latin. Then in broken Norse she's learned from traders at the abbey gates. "May every breath you take be poison. I will never forgive you." The words feel hollow in her mouth, powerless against the reality of the rope binding her wrists. But they're all she has left. Her vows, her hatred, her promise of vengeance carved into the deepest chamber of her heart. They throw her across his horse like a sack of grain. The animal's flanks are warm and alive beneath her cheek, smelling of sweat and leather. And as they begin to move, she watches her world disappear behind them, the abbey collapsing in on itself, sending sparks spiraling into the twilight sky like condemned souls seeking heaven. The villages they pass through blur together in a nightmare of faces. Some spit at her, calling her Saxon whore. Others cheer for Leif, praising his prowess in battle. Children point and laugh. Old women make warding signs. And through it all, Astrid remains silent, her jaw clenched so tight her teeth ache, because if she opens her mouth, she will scream and never stop. Leif doesn't speak to her. doesn't look at her. His silence feels deliberate, calculated, and it fills her with a rage that burns hotter than the abbey flames. She memorizes the line of his shoulders, the way his hand rests on his sword hilt, the rhythm of his breathing. "Know your enemy," the abbess once told her during lessons on spiritual warfare. "Understand what drives them, and you will find their weakness." Astrid plans to find every weakness this man possesses and exploit them until he breaks. The farmhouse appears as the sun bleeds out across the horizon, a lonely structure squatting against rolling hills of dead grass and naked trees. No other dwellings nearby, no smoke from neighboring hearths, no sounds of life except the caw of crows settling in skeletal branches. The isolation strikes her as strange. Don't these northern warriors live in halls filled with kinsmen, boasting and drinking and celebrating their victories? Why does this feared fighter dwell alone in this cold, forgotten place? Inside, the house holds an emptiness that presses against her skin like a physical weight. Sparse furniture, weapons hung on walls, a hearth that looks rarely used. But there's something else too, a sense of deliberate abandonment, as if someone once tried to make this place a home and then simply gave up. A half-finished tapestry droops from a loom in the corner. Children's toys gather dust on a high shelf. A woman's cloak hangs by the door, untouched, moth-eaten. That night, after hours of suffocating silence, Leaf cuts the ropes binding her wrists. The relief is immediate and excruciating. Blood rushing back into numb fingers, pins and needles dancing up her arms. She gasps despite herself and hates that he heard it. He steps back, puts distance between them, and speaks for the first time since claiming her. "You are free to run if you wish," he says in careful accented Latin. His voice is deeper than she expected, roughened by years of battle cries and cold northern winds. The nearest village is half a day's walk east. The winter will kill you before you reach it, but the choice is yours. Astrid stares at him, searching for mockery in his face and finding only a terrible, hollow exhaustion. This is no mercy. It's a dare, a challenge. He's giving her the illusion of freedom while knowing the land itself will be her prison. The cruelty of it steals her breath, and yet something in his eyes troubles her, something that doesn't fit with the monster she's constructed in her mind. He looks at her the way men look at gravestones. The cold creeps through every crack in the walls, finding her bones, reminding her that pride is no match for a Norse winter. She moves closer to the fire without asking permission, without acknowledging him, and curls into herself on the floor. The warmth barely touches her, but she can feel his presence like a storm cloud, heavy with unspoken words and old wounds. As her eyes grow heavy and the fire burns down to embers, Astrid makes a silent vow that will define everything to come. She will survive this winter. She will learn his weaknesses. She will make him trust her, perhaps even care for her. And then, when he least expects it, when his guard is finally down, she will destroy him from within. Not with a blade. That would be too quick, too merciful. She will dismantle his soul piece by piece until there's nothing left but the same hollow emptiness she sees in this cursed house. The last thing she notices before sleep claims her is a sound she can't quite place. Something between a sigh and a prayer, coming from where Leif stands silhouetted against the window, watching the darkness beyond as if waiting for something that will never return. Morning comes with a gentleness that feels like violence against everything she knows. She wakes to the smell of fresh bread, warm and yeasty, impossible in this house of ghosts. Through barely opened eyes, she watches Leif at the hearth, his massive frame somehow careful and domestic as he tends the fire, checks the bread, moves through the space like a man trying to remember how to be human. The axe outside bites into wood with steady rhythm. He's already been up for hours, splitting logs for a fire meant to keep her warm. The dissonance between what he is and what he's doing makes her head ache. He hasn't touched her, hasn't demanded anything, and somehow, inexplicably, that terrifies her more than violence ever could. The bread tastes like betrayal on Astrid's tongue. Too good, too warm, too careful. She chews slowly, watching Leif through the steam rising from the wooden bowl he's placed before her, searching for the trap she knows must be hidden in this performance of domesticity. Outside, the rhythmic thunk of his axe splitting wood carries through the morning air, each blow precise and measured. and she wonders if that's how he kills. Methodically, without passion, making death just another chore to complete before sunset. The simplicity of the cabin unsettles her more with each passing hour. There are no trophies of war mounted on the walls, no stolen treasures displayed like the other raiders surely do. Just functional furniture worn smooth by use, a well-maintained hearth, and that oppressive silence that seems to seep from the very timbers. She moves through the space when he's outside, touching things she shouldn't, looking for evidence of the monster she needs him to be. Instead, she finds tools arranged with care, weapons cleaned and oiled, everything in its place as if order might somehow atone for chaos committed elsewhere. When Leif attempts conversation, his Latin halting and careful, she responds with calculated silence. Each word he offers hangs in the air between them like smoke, dissipating into nothing when she refuses to acknowledge it. She watches his jaw tighten, sees frustration flicker across his scarred features before he turns away, and she counts it as a small victory. Let him feel powerless for once. Let him know what it's like to be invisible. But the village has no such restraint. When he takes her to the settlement 3 days later, she needs warmer clothes, he explains in that gruff, reluctant voice. The whispers start before they even reach the first dwelling. Eyes follow them like hungry wolves tracking wounded prey. An old woman spits at Astrid's feet. A group of men outside the tavern fall silent, their gazes sliding between her nun's tattered dress and Leif's rigid posture, and she can practically taste their speculation, sour and poisonous on the wind. The warrior brought himself a nun, someone mutters in Norse, loud enough for her to hear, testing whether she understands their tongue. Wife or slave, you think? Maybe both. Laughter ripples through the crowd, cruel and knowing, and Astrid feels something cold slither down her spine. The rumors will spread like fire through dry grass. She can already see it happening, the way information passes from mouth to ear, growing more twisted with each telling. By sunset, the entire territory will have opinions about what happens in that isolated farmhouse, about what Leif does to the Christian woman in the darkness. Leif's hand flexes near his sword, but he doesn't draw it, doesn't respond, just walks faster, his presence a wall between her and the crowd. And for one disorienting moment, Astrid isn't sure if he's protecting her or claiming her more thoroughly than any words could. The merchant who sells them wool and furs won't meet her eyes, counting coins with shaking fingers, desperate for them to leave his shop. The transaction feels contaminated, shameful, as if buying her clothing is somehow more obscene than dragging her here as spoils of war. That afternoon, while Leif is summoned to the Count's hall, some matter of tribute and oaths, she gathers from his tight expression. Astrid finds herself alone in the cabin for the first time. The silence should feel like freedom, but instead it presses down like a suffocating weight, making her hyper-aware of every creak and groan in the timbers. She tells herself she's looking for weapons, for anything she might use when the moment comes, but her feet carry her to the far corner where the floorboards don't quite sit flush with their neighbors. Her fingers find the gap easily, prying up the loose planks to reveal a wooden box hidden in the darkness beneath. The hinges protest as she opens it, a small shriek of rusted metal that makes her heart slam against her ribs. Inside, nestled in rotting cloth, she finds an iron cross, broken cleanly in half, the edges still sharp enough to cut. And beneath it, folded with reverent care, a veil, white linen stained with rust-brown splotches that she recognizes with sick certainty as old blood. The world tilts. Her breathing goes shallow and fast, panic clawing up her throat because this means something terrible and profound that she can't quite grasp but feels hovering just beyond her comprehension. He had a woman, maybe a Christian woman, maybe a nun. The veil's fabric is fine, expensive, not the rough weave the abbey provided for its sisters. Someone of importance wore this, someone who bled, someone who ended up hidden beneath the floorboards of a Viking warrior's empty house. Questions multiply like maggots in her mind, each one more disturbing than the last. Did he love her? Kill her? Watch her die? Is Astrid a replacement, a penance, an attempt to resurrect something long dead? The desire to understand burns hotter than her hatred ever did, and she hates herself for caring. for needing to know the story behind these relics when she should be focused solely on revenge. When Leif returns hours later, snow dusting his shoulders and clinging to his beard, Astrid is still holding the veil. She doesn't put it away, doesn't pretend she hasn't been digging through his secrets. Instead, she lifts her chin and meets his eyes with the cross and veil clutched in her trembling hands, and watches all the color drain from his face. Whose veil was this? Her voice comes out stronger than she feels, each word a blade thrown at the center of whatever wound she's just exposed. He freezes in the doorway, one hand still on the latch, snowmelt dripping from his cloak to pool on the floor. For a long moment he doesn't speak, doesn't move, and she can see him deciding what truth to offer, what lie might serve better. His throat works, swallowing words before they can form. His eyes, those cold, distant eyes, suddenly shine with moisture that catches the firelight. Someone I couldn't protect, he finally manages, his voice barely above a whisper, rough with something that might be grief or guilt, or both tangled together until they're indistinguishable. He doesn't elaborate, doesn't offer explanations or excuses, just stands there dripping melted snow and radiating a pain so raw it fills the room like a living thing. Astrid wants to press harder, to demand every detail, to use this weakness against him. But something in his expression stops her, a devastation so complete it mirrors her own when they dragged her from the burning abbey. For the first time since he claimed her as his prize, she sees him not as a conqueror but as another survivor of violence, another person carrying weight that threatens to crush them beneath its impossible burden. She doesn't forgive him, doesn't soften toward him. But in that moment, standing in the dying light with artifacts of someone else's tragedy between them, the clarity of her hatred wavers just enough to let confusion seep through the cracks. He is the enemy. He must remain the enemy. Yet enemies aren't supposed to look at relics of the dead with eyes that beg for absolution they know they don't deserve. That night, she dreams of flames and screaming. But this time, the voice crying out belongs to someone she doesn't recognize. A woman calling Leif's name with desperate terror as fire consumes her. Astrid wakes gasping, sweat cooling on her skin despite the winter cold, and finds the blood-stained veil clutched in her own hands, though she has no memory of taking it to bed with her. The fabric feels alive somehow, pulsing with old grief and unanswered questions. Across the room, Leif sits by the dying fire, his face haunted and sleepless, and she knows with absolute certainty that he heard her cry out in the darkness, that he's been watching to make sure she's safe, and that realization terrifies her more than any nightmare ever could. The tension between them grows like frost on glass, beautiful in its complexity, dangerous in its fragility. Leif moves through the cabin with the careful deliberation of a man navigating a room full of sleeping wolves, each gesture measured, each glance weighted with things he won't say. When he breaks bread for their morning meal, Astrid watches his hands divide the loaf with mathematical precision and realizes he's been giving her the larger portion for days now, always, without comment, without expectation of gratitude. She should feel nothing, should see only manipulation in every kindness. But something treacherous stirs beneath her ribs when she catches him wincing as he lifts the water bucket, favoring his left side where an old wound clearly hasn't healed properly. He never complains, never asks for help, just pushes through the pain with the same grim determination he seems to apply to everything, as if suffering is simply another task to be endured until death finally grants relief. The compassion that rises in her throat tastes like poison. She swallows it down hard, reminding herself of Sister Margaret's dead eyes, of the abbey burning, of her life torn apart by men exactly like him. But the hatred that once felt solid as stone now has cracks running through it, and through those fissures seeps a terrible, unwanted understanding that threatens everything she's built her survival upon. At the village market 3 days later, Astrid stands beside Leif as he haggles over winter vegetables, and an ancient woman with milky eyes and hands twisted by age grabs her wrist with surprising strength. The old woman's fingers feel like bird bones wrapped in parchment, her grip urgent and desperate. "Careful, girl," she hisses in heavily accented Latin, her breath smelling of herbs and decay. His eyes weep for sins even the gods won't forgive. "I've seen his kind before. Men who carry their dead on their backs until the weight crushes them. You think you know suffering? You don't know anything yet. The woman releases her abruptly and shuffles away, leaving Astrid's skin crawling with foreboding, the words echoing in her skull like a prophecy or a curse. She wants to dismiss it as the ravings of a mad crone, but the phrase lodges in her mind like a splinter. Sins even the gods won't forgive. What could be so terrible that divine mercy itself turns away? What burden does Leif carry that makes him choose this isolation, this half-life in a house filled with ghosts? That evening, restless and pursued by questions she can't answer, Astrid follows him. He thinks she's asleep by the fire, her breathing deep and regular, and perhaps that's why he doesn't notice when she slips out after him into the blue twilight. The snow crunches softly beneath her borrowed boots as she tracks his footprints to the barn, a structure she's barely glanced at before, assuming it held only livestock and hay. Through a gap in the weathered boards, she watches him kneel in the straw-scattered darkness. At first, she thinks he's checking on the animals, but then she sees it. A crude cross fashioned from 2 pieces of wood bound with leather cord, planted in the dirt floor like a grave marker. And Leif, this Viking warrior who raids Christian lands and burns abbeys, kneels before it with his head bowed and his lips moving in silent prayer. The sight punches the air from her lungs. Her hands grip the rough wood of the barn wall to keep herself upright as the world she understands fractures into incomprehensible pieces. He's praying. Not to his Norse gods with their violent glory and mead halls. He's praying to her God, in her language, with the broken desperation of someone who doesn't expect to be heard, but can't stop himself from trying anyway. And then he's weeping. Great, silent sobs that shake his massive frame, tears catching the thin light filtering through the walls. His hands clench in the straw, white-knuckled and trembling, and she hears him whisper words that make her blood run cold. Forgive me. God, forgive me. I didn't know. I didn't know she was there. I didn't know. Astrid should leave, should retreat before he discovers her witnessing this private devastation. But her feet have grown roots, and she stands frozen as he continues his litany of anguish. Each phrase another piece of a puzzle she's beginning to understand, and wishes desperately she didn't. When he finally senses her presence, perhaps he hears her breathing. Perhaps he simply feels the weight of her stare. He doesn't startle or hide his tears, just turns his head slowly, meeting her eyes through the gap in the boards, and the raw vulnerability in his expression is more naked than any body could be. No walls, no armor, just a man drowning in guilt so profound it's become the only thing keeping him alive. You don't understand, he says, his voice wrecked and hollow. You can't understand what it means to kill for orders that aren't yours, to follow commands that destroy everything you believe in because refusing means watching your own child die screaming. He wipes his face with the back of his hand, smearing tears into the dirt already caked there. I have blood on my hands that no amount of prayer will wash clean. I know that. God knows that. But I pray anyway because it's all I have left. The hatred in Astrid's chest, that solid, righteous fury she's clung to like a shield, cracks down the middle. Not breaking entirely, not dissolving into forgiveness, but fracturing just enough that she can see through to something more complicated underneath. He's a monster who prays, a killer who weeps, a man who destroyed her world and clearly destroyed his own in the process. She doesn't speak, can't speak, just watches as he pushes himself upright with the exhausted movements of someone infinitely older than his years and walks past her into the night without another word. The cross remains standing in the barn floor, a testament to faith that survives despite everything that should have murdered it. That night, unable to sleep, Astrid sits by the fire turning over everything she's witnessed, everything she thought she knew rearranging itself into new and terrible configurations. When Leif emerges from the back room where he's been giving her the only bed while he sleeps on the floor, another kindness she'd refused to acknowledge, he carries something wrapped in cloth. He sits across from her, the flames painting shadows across his scarred face, and unwraps a necklace. Simple, crude even. A pendant carved from bone, yellowed with age, strung on braided leather. He holds it out to her with hands that shake almost imperceptibly. and his voice when he speaks is barely audible over the crackling fire. "This belonged to someone pure," he says, each word seeming to cost him something vital. Someone who believed the world could be better. Someone who died believing it even as everything burned around them. He places it in her palm, folding her fingers around it with a gentleness that contradicts everything she knows about violence. "I have nothing else to give you, nothing that isn't stained, but this, maybe this remembers what goodness looked like." The bone is warm from his hands, smooth from years of being carried close to someone's heart. Astrid stares at it, this offering that feels less like a gift and more like a confession, a plea, a transfer of burden from his soul to hers. She should refuse it, should throw it in his face and remind him that nothing he offers can absolve what he's done. Instead, she lifts it to her neck with trembling fingers and lets him fasten the clasp, his rough hands surprisingly careful against her skin. The pendant settles against her collarbone, foreign and intimate, and she feels something shift between them that she lacks the vocabulary to name. She wears it to sleep that night, the bone pendant resting over her heart, and dreams of ashes and prayer and hands that kill, but also know how to be gentle. When morning comes and light streams through the gaps in the shutters, Astrid examines the pendant more closely, turns it over, and freezes, the blood draining from her face so fast she feels dizzy. Carved into the reverse side, worn but unmistakable, is a coat of arms she would recognize in her sleep, the symbol of the House of Wessex, the emblem of her father's family, the crest of the count who died the night the Vikings came. The pendant burns against Astrid's skin like a brand, the weight of it suddenly unbearable, though it's lighter than a bird's hollow bones. Her father's crest, the symbol she drew 1,000 times as a child, tracing its lines in dirt and snow, wearing it proudly before her mother died and her father sent her to the abbey for safekeeping. The floor seems to drop away beneath her feet, and she grips the edge of the table to keep from falling into the abyss opening in her chest. How does a Viking warrior possess the family emblem of the man he murdered? The question circles her mind like a vulture, each pass revealing new horrors. Did Leif take it from her father's corpse as a trophy? Did he carve the crest himself as some twisted memorial? Or, and this possibility makes her stomach clench with nausea, was he there that night, standing in her father's hall when the blade fell, when the Count of Wessex bled out on stones that had witnessed 3 generations of her bloodline? She presses her palm against the pendant, feeling the carved lines through her skin, and forces her breathing to slow. Control. She needs control. If Leif sees the recognition in her eyes, if he realizes she knows what this symbol means, everything changes. The fragile understanding growing between them will shatter, and she'll lose any chance of discovering the full truth before she decides how to use it. When he emerges from chopping wood, snow dusting his shoulders and his breath clouding in the frigid air, Astrid has her face arranged into careful gratitude. She touches the pendant and offers him a small smile, the first deliberate kindness she's shown him, and watches something dangerous bloom in his expression. Hope, the most treacherous emotion of all. "Thank you," she says in halting Norse, the words foreign and bitter on her tongue but necessary. "It's beautiful." The lie tastes like ash, but she swallows it down and holds his gaze, letting him see what he wants to see. Acceptance. Perhaps even the beginnings of forgiveness. Over the following days, Astrid becomes a hunter in her own right, stalking information instead of prey. She watches Leif with the focused intensity of a scholar studying ancient texts, cataloging his habits, his patterns, the things that make him flinch or grow distant. She notices how he avoids the village feast hall, how he turns down invitations from other warriors with excuses that sound rehearsed, how he never displays any trophies or speaks of past victories the way she's heard other raiders boast. At night, when he thinks she's sleeping, she listens to him talk in his dreams. His voice fractures around words she can barely make out, names that mean nothing to her, pleas for forgiveness in both Latin and Norse, and once, terribly, the name Wessex, spoken with such anguish it makes her eyes burn with unwanted tears. He was there. He was definitely there when her father died. The conflict inside her becomes a living thing, a beast with teeth and claws that tears at her from within. Every kind gesture from Leaf feels like a betrayal of her father's memory. Yet every moment of vulnerability she witnesses makes it harder to see him as only a monster. He's the man who destroyed her world, yes, but he's also clearly destroying himself from the inside out, and she can't reconcile these truths into anything coherent. She finds herself studying his hands as he works. Scarred, capable of terrible violence, yet gentle when he hands her morning bread or tucks a blanket around her shoulders when she falls asleep by the fire. Those same hands killed her father. Those same hands carved a cross to pray before. The contradiction makes her head ache and her certainty crumble. One evening, as he stokes the fire and the shadows dance across the cabin walls, Astrid decides to test the depth of water she's wading into. Her voice comes out steadier than her heart feels. "Tell me about the Count," she says, watching him carefully. "The one whose crest this is." Leif's shoulders stiffen, his hand freezing midway to adding another log. The silence stretches so long she thinks he won't answer, that she's pushed too hard, too fast. But then he sets down the wood with deliberate care and turns to face her, his expression carved from stone and old grief. "What do you want to know?" His voice is flat, carefully neutral, but she can see the pulse jumping in his throat, the way his jaw clenches against whatever truths he's holding back. "Who was he? Why do you have this?" She lifts the pendant, lets it catch the firelight. "You said it belonged to someone pure. Was it his?" Leif closes his eyes, and for a moment she thinks he might refuse to answer. But then he begins to speak, each word pulled from him like arrows being extracted from old wounds. "He was a good man, better than most nobles. He tried to protect his people, to maintain peace between the Saxons and Norse settlements." His hands curl into fists at his sides. "I was ordered to raid his territory, told his hall harbored weapons meant to attack our settlements, intelligence that turned out to be lies, manipulation by men who wanted war more than they wanted truth." Astrid's heart hammers against her ribs so hard she's certain he can hear it. "And the pendant?" "It was his daughter's. She wore it always. He had it made for her before sending her to the abbey." Leif's voice cracks, and he has to pause, swallow, force the words out. She was supposed to be safe there. That's what he believed when he sent her away. That's what I believed when I took the pendant from his body, thinking to return it to her someday as proof of what her father tried to protect even in death. The room spins. Astrid grips the table edge, her knuckles white, her breath coming in shallow gasps. He doesn't know. Leif doesn't realize he's speaking to that daughter, that the woman he claimed as a war prize is the very person he thought to make amends to with this pathetic token of atonement. What happened to her? The question emerges as barely a whisper. The daughter. Leif turns away, staring into the fire as if it holds answers written in flame. The abbey burned. They all died. Every last one. His voice is hollow, scraped clean of everything but regret. "I killed her father, and my brothers in arms killed her. There's no redemption for that, no prayer powerful enough, no penance sufficient." The confession hangs between them like smoke, and Astrid feels something crack in her chest. Not her hatred, but her certainty about what that hatred means, about how cleanly she can divide the world into victims and villains when the man before her is clearly both. "Who killed him?" she forces herself to ask, though she already knows, has always known since the moment she understood what the pendant meant. "Who killed the Count?" Leif meets her eyes, and she sees the answer there before he speaks it, written in every line of exhausted guilt carved into his features. "I did," he says simply. "I drove the blade into his chest while he was defending the weak and unarmed. I followed orders instead of conscience, and I've died 1,000 times for it, since without ever having the mercy of actually being dead." The words should unleash her fury, should crystallize every ounce of hatred into pure, focused rage. Instead, Astrid feels something more terrifying settle over her. Understanding. Not forgiveness, never forgiveness, but a comprehension of the machinery that grinds people into dust regardless of their intentions, that turns good men into killers and princesses into prizes, and leaves everyone covered in blood they never wanted to spill. She stands slowly, crosses the small space between them, and does the most dangerous thing she's ever done. She embraces him, wraps her arms around this man who murdered her father, pulls him close, and feels him shudder against her, as if he's the one falling apart. "I forgive you." She lies, her lips against his shoulder, her hand sliding to the knife tucked in her belt beneath her cloak. The blade her father gave her before he sent her away, the only piece of him she managed to hide from the raiders. The weapon she's been carrying ever since, waiting for this exact moment. Leif's arms come around her, hesitant and desperate, and she feels his tears dampen her hair. He thinks she's granting absolution. He has no idea she's positioning the blade against his ribs, finding the gap in his defenses, preparing to drive it home and end this entire nightmare. Her hand trembles. The knife point dimples his shirt. One thrust and it's over. Vengeance served. Justice claimed. Her father's death avenged. But her hand won't complete the motion. Won't make the final push that would sink steel into flesh. Because the man crying against her shoulder isn't the monster she needs him to be, and killing him would make her into something she's not certain she can survive becoming. Snow falls thick and silent outside the cabin, blanketing the world in white that feels less like purity and more like a shroud. Astrid watches the flakes accumulate on the windowsill while her mind calculates trajectories of destruction more complex than any blade thrust could accomplish. The knife remains hidden in her belt, a secret that burns hotter than the fire crackling in the hearth. But her plan has evolved into something far more devastating than simple murder. She will break him slowly, methodically. She'll make him believe in redemption, in the possibility of being loved despite the blood on his hands, and then she'll rip that hope away and watch him crumble into nothing. Death would be mercy. This will be justice. Every smile she offers is a weapon sharpened on the whetstone of her grief. Every gentle word a poison administered in doses too small to detect until the cumulative effect destroys him completely. Leif moves through the cabin with cautious optimism she finds almost painful to witness. Since her embrace, since her lie of forgiveness, something has shifted in him, a lightness creeping into shoulders that have carried mountains of guilt. He hums while preparing meals, a tuneless sound that speaks of forgotten contentment trying to resurface. The hope in his eyes when he looks at her makes her stomach twist with something that might be shame if she let herself examine it too closely. Tonight he produces wine from somewhere deep in the cellar. Good wine, probably looted from some nobleman's collection, the irony not lost on her. He pours it into wooden cups with hands that shake slightly, nervous as a boy courting his first love, and the comparison makes bile rise in her throat. This isn't courtship. This is warfare conducted on a battlefield he doesn't realize exists. "I need to tell you something," Leif says, settling across from her with his cup cradled between scarred palms. The firelight catches the silver threading through his beard, makes him look older and infinitely more tired. "About why I was at Wessex, about why I had no choice." Astrid sips the wine. It tastes of oak and bitter cherries, and arranges her face into receptive softness while her heart hammers against her ribs. "Tell me," she says, reaching across to touch his hand with calculated tenderness. "I want to understand." The words spill from him like blood from a reopened wound. He tells her about his son, a boy of barely 7 years with his mother's gentle eyes and his father's stubborn chin. How the Danish king took the child hostage to ensure Leif's loyalty, to guarantee he would lead the raid on Wessex when intelligence suggested the Count was amassing weapons for an assault on Norse settlements. How Leif bargained, pleaded, offered himself in the boy's place, but the king only laughed and promised the child's safe return after the mission's success. "I thought if I just followed orders, did what they demanded, I could save him." Leif's voice cracks around the edges, wine sloshing in his cup as his hands tremble with the force of memory. "I told myself one life for another, the Count for my son. That somehow the mathematics of it would balance, that God would understand a father's desperation." Astrid feels her chest constrict despite herself, despite the armor she's tried to build around her heart. "What happened?" she whispers, though part of her doesn't want to know, suspects the answer will complicate everything she's trying to keep simple. "We took Wessex. The Count fell by my blade. I sent word immediately that the deed was done." His tears fall freely now, splashing onto the rough wooden table between them. 3 days later, they sent me a box. Inside was my son's head, his eyes still open like he was surprised, like he didn't understand why his father hadn't saved him. The cup slips from his fingers, wine spreading across the table like fresh blood. The king said he'd been dead before we ever reached Wessex, that it was never about loyalty, just about removing any reason I might have to refuse future orders. A man with nothing to lose makes the perfect weapon. The room tilts. Astrid's carefully constructed walls of hatred crack under the weight of this revelation, and she hates herself for the sympathy flooding through the fissures. He killed her father to save a son who was already dead, became a murderer for nothing, lost everything and gained only the knowledge that his sacrifice meant less than nothing to the men who commanded it. The woman, she hears herself say, the one with the veil. Was she his mother? My wife? Leif wipes his face with the back of his hand, smearing tears into beard and dirt. When I returned and told her what I'd done, what I'd become, she looked at me like I was already dead, took our son's body and walked into our burning house. Chose fire over living with what I'd made myself into. His eyes meet hers, raw and desperate. I've been dead ever since. Just a corpse that forgot to stop moving. Astrid's hand moves without conscious thought, reaching across to grip his, and she feels the knife in her belt like an accusation. How do you destroy a man who's already destroyed himself? How do you make someone suffer who's been suffering every moment since the last time he felt joy? The mathematics of vengeance suddenly seem impossibly complex, the clean lines of justice blurring into something she can't navigate. You're not dead, she whispers, and realizes with horror that she means it, that somewhere beneath the calculated performance she's been giving, genuine emotion has taken root. You're here. You're trying. That has to count for something. Leif looks at her like she's offered him salvation itself, and his hand comes up to cup her face with a gentleness that makes her want to weep. I don't deserve your forgiveness, he says. Don't deserve your kindness. But God help me. I'm selfish enough to take both anyway. When he kisses her, she tastes salt and wine and desperation, and her response is genuine before she remembers it's supposed to be strategy. The line between performance and reality dissolves as his arms come around her, pulling her close like she's the only thing keeping him tethered to life. She kisses him back with all the grief and rage and confused longing churning inside her, and doesn't know anymore where the lie ends and truth begins. The knife presses against her ribs through the fabric of her dress, a reminder of original intentions, but her hands don't reach for it. Instead, they tangle in his hair, pull him closer, seek comfort in the warmth of another broken person who understands what it means to have your world burned away and still somehow keep breathing. They don't see the shadow pass across the window, don't hear the crunch of boots retreating through fresh snow, don't know that Bjorn, one of the younger warriors from the settlement, has witnessed their embrace and is already composing the story he'll tell in the feast hall. How the mighty Leif Gunnarsson has betrayed his Norse blood by lying with a Christian slave. How he's become soft and weak. How he deserves the same fate as any traitor. That night, Astrid lies in Leif's arms, feeling his heartbeat against her cheek, and tries to remember why she hates him. The reasons are still there. Her father's death, the burning abbey, the life stolen from her, but they're buried now beneath layers of complication that make simple vengeance feel impossible. She's supposed to be destroying him, but instead she's falling into an abyss where distinctions between victim and perpetrator, love and hate, justice and cruelty, all blur into one aching confusion. The knock on the door comes at dawn, sharp, official, carrying the weight of authority. Through the window, Astrid sees armed men bearing the Count's colors, and her stomach drops. Leif opens the door with the resigned expression of someone who's been expecting this, who maybe even welcomes it as a form of escape. Leif Gunnarsson, the captain announces, his voice carrying across the snow-hushed morning. You are summoned to the hall to answer charges of dishonoring your people and your blood. The punishment for such treason is banishment or death. Leif doesn't argue, doesn't resist. Just pulls on his cloak and looks back at Astrid with eyes that ask forgiveness for bringing this consequence into her life. She watches them take him away, watches him walk toward judgment without protest, and realizes with sick certainty that he might actually welcome death as release from the guilt that's been killing him slowly for years. The captain turns to her, his expression cold and disgusted. "You'll be returned to the prisoner compounds at first light tomorrow. Consider yourself lucky we don't execute Christian whores alongside Norse traitors." The door slams, leaving Astrid alone in the cabin that suddenly feels enormous and terribly empty, and she understands that her plan for slow destruction has been overtaken by events. They're going to kill him, or exile him, and she'll be sent back to whatever hell awaits captured enemies, separated from him before she's even figured out whether she wants him destroyed or saved. The courtyard of the Count's estate swarms with bodies pressed shoulder to shoulder, breath clouding in the frozen air like the exhalations of some many-headed beast hungry for blood. Astrid's wrists burn beneath iron shackles that bite deep enough to leave marks she'll carry forever, if there is a forever beyond this moment. The guards drag her through the crowd roughly, deliberately, making a spectacle of the Christian woman who corrupted one of their warriors, and she feels every eye on her like brands searing her skin. Leif kneels in the center of the yard, his hands bound behind his back, his head bowed but not in submission. There's a terrible dignity in his posture, even in chains, a refusal to beg or plead that makes something in Astrid's chest constrict painfully. Snow has begun to fall again, settling on his shoulders and hair like premature ash, and she wants to scream at him to fight, to defend himself, to do anything but accept this fate with such devastating resignation. The Count, a massive man with a beard braided with silver rings and eyes like chips of flint, stands on the raised platform overlooking the spectacle. His voice booms across the courtyard, carrying over the murmur of the assembled crowd. "Leif Gunnarsson, you stand accused of betraying your blood by lying with this Christian slave, of choosing her comfort over the honor of your people, of becoming soft and weak when we need warriors strong and true." He pauses, letting the words sink in, letting the crowd's anger build. "Your brothers saw you embrace her, kiss her, treat her as a wife when she is nothing but spoils of war, a possession to be used and discarded." The crowd roars approval, fists pumping in the air, voices calling for punishment. Astrid sees faces she recognizes from the village, the merchant who sold them wool, the old woman who warned her, warriors who probably fought alongside Leif in countless battles. None of them speak in his defense. None of them question the judgment being rendered. "The law is clear," the Count continues, his voice cutting through the noise like a blade through flesh. "You will choose your fate. Kill the woman with your own hands. Prove your loyalty was merely momentary weakness, and you may remain among us, or refuse and be exiled into the mountains where winter will do what your conscience prevents." He leans forward, eyes narrowing. "Choose now, Gunnarsson, death or banishment, her life or yours." The silence that follows feels like the held breath before an avalanche. Every person in that courtyard seems frozen, waiting for Leif's response, and Astrid realizes with crystalline clarity that this is the moment that will define everything. If he chooses to kill her, she'll die knowing the brief connection between them meant nothing against survival. If he refuses, they'll both be condemned to slow death in frozen wilderness. She wants to tell him to do it. To take the blade they're offering and drive it into her heart. To save himself and end this impossible situation where every choice leads to suffering. Better a quick death here than starvation and cold in the mountains. Better to die than continue living in this confusion where she can't tell anymore what she feels, what she wants, whether the hatred that brought her this far can sustain her any further. But Leif lifts his head, and his eyes find hers across the snow-dusted courtyard. The look that passes between them contains more than words could ever express: apology and acceptance, grief and something that might be love if either of them dared name it. She sees him make the decision before he speaks it, sees it settle into his features like the final piece of a puzzle that's been incomplete his entire life. "No," he says simply. The word falls into the silence like a stone into still water, sending ripples of shock through the assembled crowd. "I've killed enough. I won't kill again. Not for you. Not for anyone." The Count's face darkens, a storm gathering behind his eyes. "You understand what you're choosing. Exile means death. The mountains in winter show no mercy. You'll freeze or starve within days. Then I'll die clean for once. Leif's voice is steady now, certain, as if refusal has given him back something he lost years ago. I'll die as a man instead of as a weapon. I won't add her blood to the ocean already on my hands. The crowd erupts, some in outrage, some in disbelief, most in the kind of bloodthirsty disappointment that comes when spectacle fails to deliver expected violence. They call him coward, traitor, worthless, and Astrid watches him absorb every insult without flinching, as if he's heard worse in his own head every day since his son died. Something breaks open inside her chest, flooding her with emotions she has no name for. This man killed her father, destroyed her world, became the enemy she swore to destroy, and now he's choosing death over hurting her one more time, surrendering everything rather than add another corpse to the mountain of guilt crushing him. Before she can think, before reason can stop her, Astrid tears free from the guard's grip and throws herself forward, her chained hands reaching for Leif even as soldiers move to restrain her. She falls to her knees beside him in the churned snow, and her voice when it comes is fierce and clear enough to cut through the chaos. "He is my lord," she declares in Norse halting but unmistakable, and then in Latin for those who understand, "The only true lord I've known since they burned my world. If you exile him, you exile me as well. I go where he goes. I die where he dies." The crowd falls silent, shocked into stillness by this declaration. Leif stares at her with something like wonder breaking across his ravaged features, and she realizes she means every word. That somewhere in the twisted path between vengeance and understanding, she's arrived at a truth she never intended. She would rather die beside him in frozen wilderness than live without knowing what this fragile, impossible thing between them might become. The Count's laughter is harsh and devoid of humor. So be it. Two fools deserve each other's company in death. He waves his hand dismissively. Take them to the mountain pass. Give them nothing. No food, no weapons, no supplies. Let them face the consequences of choosing weakness over strength. As the guards haul them to their feet, Astrid catches sight of faces in the crowd. Some show satisfaction, others discomfort, and a few, surprisingly, something that might be respect. An old warrior with scars covering half his face nods once, almost imperceptibly, as if he understands something about choosing death with dignity that the younger men haven't learned yet. They're thrown into a cart like cargo, their chains finally removed because what need is there for restraints when the wilderness itself becomes prison? As they roll toward the mountain pass, Leif's hand finds hers, gripping with desperate intensity, and when he speaks, his voice is raw with emotion. "You should have let them send you back. Should have saved yourself. Why would you choose this?" Astrid looks at their intertwined fingers, her small hand pale against his scarred and weathered one, and tries to find words for something that defies explanation. "Because you chose not to kill me when it would have saved you. Because somewhere between hating you and understanding you, I lost the ability to watch you die alone." She meets his eyes. "Because maybe we're both already dead, and this is just the long walk toward accepting it." The cart stops at the edge of the wilderness, where even the bravest hunters rarely venture. The mountains rise before them like the spine of some ancient creature, snow-covered and forbidding, promising nothing but cold and darkness and eventual silence. The guards push them out without ceremony, and the cart retreats, leaving them standing at the threshold of oblivion. As they turn to face the mountains, Astrid sees movement in the tree line, shadows that resolve into shapes that might be men but move with predatory purpose. Her hand tightens on Leif's arm. "We're being followed," she whispers. He sees them too, and his jaw clenches. The Count's men. They're not content to let the mountains kill us slowly. They want to finish it today and claim it was wilderness that took our lives. The shadows advance, emerging from the trees with weapons drawn, and Astrid understands with perfect clarity that they're not going to make it to the mountains at all. They're going to die here now, at the hands of men determined to erase the embarrassment of Leif's defiance. The mountains swallow them whole, indifferent to whether they live or die. For 3 days, they climb higher into wilderness that feels less like landscape and more like the physical manifestation of abandonment. Endless white punctuated by skeletal trees and rocks sharp enough to draw blood through worn boots. Astrid's lungs burn with every breath of air so cold it feels like inhaling knives, and beside her, Leif moves with the mechanical determination of someone who stopped feeling his body's protests miles ago. They survived the assassins through sheer desperation and luck. Leif fought with bare hands against armed men, his years of battle experience compensating for lack of weapons, while Astrid used rocks and branches and teeth when necessary. Two men lie dead in the snow at the forest's edge, a secret the wilderness will keep until spring thaw reveals their frozen corpses. The memory of killing sits like lead in Astrid's stomach, but survival has a way of making philosophers into murderers and nuns into warriors. Now, huddled in an abandoned hunting shelter, they discovered more through divine intervention than skill. They share what little warmth their bodies can generate. The structure is barely more than leaning timbers and moss-chinked gaps, but it blocks the worst of the wind that howls through the mountain passes like the voices of everyone they've failed. Leif shivers violently despite being pressed against her, his breath coming in ragged gasps that speak of something more than cold. "Let me see," Astrid demands, pulling at his cloak. He tries to wave her away but lacks the strength to resist. When she peels back the layers of clothing, her heart plummets. The wound in his side, sustained during the fight with the Count's men, has turned the edges of the gash an angry red that promises infection. Blood seeps through the makeshift bandage she tore from her dress, dark and worrying. "It's nothing," he lies through chattering teeth. "I've had worse." "Don't." Her voice cracks with emotion she can't contain anymore. "Don't pretend. Not now. Not after everything." She works by firelight so faint it barely qualifies as illumination, using snow to clean the wound and strips of cloth to bind it. Her hands shake from cold and fear as she tends him, and she finds herself praying. To the God she served in the Abbey, to his Norse God she doesn't understand, to anything that might be listening in this frozen hell. He can't die here. Not like this. Not before she figures out whether loving him makes her a traitor to her father's memory, or finally makes her human again. Between bouts of consciousness, Leif speaks, sometimes in Norse, sometimes in Latin, sometimes in fevered combinations of both. He calls for his son, apologizes to ghosts, relives battles she's grateful not to witness clearly. And once, in a moment of devastating clarity, he grips her hand with surprising strength and whispers, "I'm sorry I couldn't be the man who deserved you from the beginning. Sorry you had to teach a monster how to be human again." "You're not a monster," she tells him, and realizes she believes it now, fully and completely. Monsters don't break themselves trying to become better. They don't choose death over causing more harm. During the darkest hours, when his breathing becomes shallow and his skin burns with fever, despite the cold, Astrid explores their meager shelter looking for anything useful. Roots that might have medicinal properties, moss dry enough to burn, hope in any form. Instead, she finds something that makes her blood freeze colder than the mountain air. Tucked in a crevice between stones, wrapped in oiled cloth to protect it from moisture, lies a leather satchel. Inside are documents, military correspondence sealed with wax-bearing Saxon and Danish crests. Her hands tremble as she breaks the seals and reads by flickering firelight, each word revealing truths that reshape everything she thought she understood. The letters detail a conspiracy. Her father, Count of Wessex, had been corresponding with Danish warlords, planning a coordinated assault on Norse settlements. But there's more. Evidence that he'd been betrayed, that someone in his own household sold information to the Viking king, information that led directly to the raid that killed him. The same king who took Leif's son hostage to ensure his compliance. And there, in her father's own hand, dated just days before his death, a confession that makes her vision blur with tears. He writes of regret, of realizing too late that his ambition for power led him to make alliances with men who had no honor. He mentions his daughter, mentions her by name, and writes, "I sent Astrid to the Abbey thinking to protect her from my enemies, but I fear I've only ensured she'll die if my plans fail. God forgive me for choosing pride over her safety." The papers slip from her numb fingers. Her father wasn't the innocent victim she'd constructed in her grief-stricken memories. He was a man who played dangerous games with dangerous people and lost. The raid on Wessex wasn't unprovoked savagery. It was retaliation for a betrayal he helped orchestrate. Leif was just another piece in a game neither of them fully understood, forced to kill a man who was himself far from innocent. The realization doesn't erase her grief, but it transforms it into something more complex than simple loss. Her father loved her. The letters prove that. But he also made choices that led directly to both their destructions. There are no clean victims here. No pure villains. Just people caught in machinery built from politics and pride, and the endless cycle of violence begetting violence. She returns to Leif's side, the documents clutched against her chest, and watches him fight for breath in restless sleep. The urge to wake him, to share this revelation, wars with the desire to let him rest, to spare him more pain when he's already enduring so much. In the end, she slides the papers back into their protective wrapping and tucks them away. Some truths can wait until survival is less uncertain. I understand now, she whispers against his fevered skin, her tears leaving cold trails down her cheeks. We were both victims of men who treated lives like game pieces. My father, your king. They destroyed us for their ambitions and left us to sort through the wreckage. She presses her lips to his forehead. But what we built from those ruins, this impossible thing between us, that's ours. They don't get to own that. Dawn brings a brief respite from the storm. Astrid ventures outside to gather more wood and finds animal tracks in the fresh snow. Rabbit or hare, something that means food if she can catch it. She fashions a crude snare from threads pulled from her dress and sets it near what looks like a game trail, then returns to find Leif conscious and watching her with eyes that hold more awareness than they have since the fever took hold. You found something, he says. It's not a question. He reads her face the way he probably once read battlefields. I can see it in your eyes. She hesitates, then retrieves the documents and tells him everything. Watches him absorb the truth of what he killed for, what he lost his son for, what transformed him from man into weapon. When she finishes, his tears come silently, and she holds him while he grieves not just for what was taken, but for the revelation that it was all meaningless, that they were both sacrificed for a conspiracy that served no one but the powerful men who orchestrated it. Your father didn't deserve to die, Leif says finally, his voice wrecked but steady. No matter what he'd done. And you didn't deserve to lose him. The sins of ambitious men shouldn't be paid for in innocent blood. Neither of us deserved any of this, Astrid agrees. But maybe what we can choose is what we do with what's left. How we love in the ruins they left us. He pulls her closer, and despite the cold and hunger and uncertain future, despite the wound seeping through his bandages and the knowledge that they might not survive another night, Astrid feels something she hasn't felt since the abbey burned. Hope. Not the naive hope of a girl who believed the world was fundamentally just, but the hard-won hope of someone who stared into darkness and chosen to strike a light anyway. If we survive this, Leif murmurs against her hair, I want to go somewhere no one knows us. Start fresh. Build something that isn't founded on anyone's blood but our own work. We'll survive, she tells him with more confidence than she feels. We've come too far to let the mountains take us now. But as night falls again and the temperature plummets, as Leif's fever spikes higher and her snare remains empty, Astrid understands that wanting to survive and actually surviving are separated by a chasm as wide as the one between vengeance and forgiveness. All they can do is hold each other through the darkness and hope that dawn finds them still breathing. The fever breaks on the 7th day, leaving Leif hollow-eyed and weak, but alive in ways that matter beyond mere breathing. Astrid holds his hand through the delirium's retreat, feeling each finger curl around hers with renewed strength, watching consciousness return to eyes that have been staring at ghosts only he could see. When he finally focuses on her face, truly sees her kneeling beside him in the wan morning light filtering through gaps in their shelter. His first words are an apology. I'm sorry, he whispers, voice scraped raw from fever and disuse. For everything. For your father. For the abbey. For dragging you into this frozen hell when you deserved. She stops him with fingers pressed gently against his cracked lips. No more apologies. Not for things we can't change. Her own voice trembles with exhaustion and something deeper, something that's been building in her chest like pressure before a storm finally breaks. Leif, listen to me. You were never my enemy, not really. His brow furrows in confusion, and she realizes he doesn't understand, can't possibly grasp what she's trying to tell him through the fog of weakness and pain. So she retrieves the documents from their hiding place and unfolds them with hands that shake from more than cold. She reads him every word, translates where his Latin fails, makes him see the machinery that ground them both into dust. My father orchestrated his own destruction, she says, the words tasting of ash and terrible freedom. He made alliances with murderers and called it politics. He risked everything for power he never lived to claim. She clutches the letters against her chest where the bone pendant still hangs, the pendant carved with her family crest that now feels less like legacy and more like warning. You killed him following orders meant to punish his betrayal. You lost your son to a king's cruelty. We were both victims of men who treated lives like currency to be spent. Leif's tears come silently, tracking through days of grime and suffering accumulated on his face. She wipes them away with her thumbs. This man who was her captor, her enemy, her unlikely salvation. The hatred she carried like armor for so long has transformed into something she barely recognizes. Not quite forgiveness, not exactly love, but perhaps that rare thing that emerges when two people broken by the same machine decide to build something new from the shattered pieces. My heart belongs to you, she confesses, and the truth of it terrifies her more than any physical danger ever could. Not because I've forgotten what happened. Not because pain erases itself through understanding, but because somehow, in the wreckage of everything we lost, we found each other. And that tiny miracle in the midst of so much death, that's worth more than all the vengeance in the world. He tries to speak, but emotion chokes the words before they can form. Instead, he pulls her down into an embrace that communicates everything language cannot: gratitude and grief, hope and desperation, the recognition that they've both been drowning and somehow managed to become each other's air. She kisses him, tasting salt and survival, feeling his heartbeat against her own like proof that life persists even when every rational reason for living has been stripped away. But we carry guilt, she murmurs against his shoulder, needing him to understand the totality of what she's accepting. Your hands took my father's life. My father's ambitions destroyed your family. We're built from that blood, Leif. We can't pretend we're not. I know. His arms tighten around her. God knows I know. But maybe carrying that weight together is lighter than carrying it alone. Maybe the only redemption available to people like us is choosing not to add more bodies to the pile. They stay like that until the fire burns to embers and needs tending, until hunger and practical necessity force them back into the brutal reality of survival. Astrid checks his wound, finally showing signs of healing, pink and clean instead of the angry red that promised death, while he watches her with an intensity that makes her aware of every movement, every breath. When we leave these mountains, he says slowly, carefully, as if testing the weight of words before committing to them, I want to go where no one knows our names. Somewhere we can be just two people trying to live with honor instead of warriors and victims and all the roles they forced on us. Is that possible? She wants to believe it, but can't quite manage the leap of faith required. Can we ever escape what we've been? I don't know, he admits with devastating honesty. But I'd rather die trying than spend whatever time I have left as a ghost haunting the scene of my crimes. The winter begins its slow retreat over the following weeks. They survive on melted snow and the occasional rabbit Astrid's improving snares catch, on hope rationed more carefully than any food, on the warmth they generate pressed together through nights that still threaten to freeze them solid. Leif teaches her to track game through snow, to read weather in the sky's color, to find shelter in landscapes that seem to offer nothing but death. She shares stories of the Abbey, of prayers and rituals that gave structure to chaos, of the God she's learning to worship differently now, not as distant judge but as presence in the act of choosing mercy over vengeance. They don't speak of the future beyond vague sketches, a cottage somewhere remote, work that uses their hands instead of violence, Maybe eventually children if God grants them that grace despite everything. The dreams feel fragile as spring ice over deep water, but they hold them carefully anyway. These small impossibilities that give purpose to survival. When the thaw finally comes in earnest and the pass downward becomes navigable, they descend slowly, carefully, two figures made gaunt by privation, but somehow more solid than they were before. At the mountain's base, they encounter a peddler with a cart loaded with early spring goods headed toward settlements where neither of them can ever return. The man eyes them suspiciously, ragged strangers appearing from wilderness that should have killed them, until Leif offers the only thing of value they possess, the bone pendant with its carved crest. The peddler's eyes widen at the craftsmanship, at the noble house symbol etched into yellowed bone, and he agrees to take them south to territories where Danish and Saxon politics matter less than survival and honest work. Astrid removes the pendant for the last time, feeling its absence like phantom weight, even as she hands it over. It's just a symbol, she tells herself, but Leif understands what the gesture costs her, the final severance from her father's legacy, from everything she was before fire and violence remade her. We'll make new symbols, he promises. Build new legacies that don't require anyone's blood but the sweat of our labor. The village they eventually settle in sits at a crossroads where trade routes meet, and no one asks too many questions about where travelers came from. They introduce themselves as husband and wife, a lie that becomes truth through repetition and choice, and find work that uses their bodies in ways that build instead of destroy. Leif in the smithy, turning his knowledge of weapons toward tools for farmers and craftsmen. Astrid helping the village healer, applying the herbal knowledge she learned from the abbey's infirmarian to wounds and illnesses that have nothing to do with war. Years pass, not easy years. They both wake screaming sometimes, haunted by ghosts that refuse to stay buried, but years filled with small redemptions accumulated like coins until they amount to something approaching peace. They never return to the territories of their pasts. Never seek revenge or vindication or anything beyond the right to exist outside the roles forced on them. On a spring morning when the world smells of new growth and possibility, Astrid stands in the doorway of their modest home watching Leif split wood for their fire. His movements have the careful precision of someone who knows exactly how much force each blow requires, no more and no less. And she thinks about how he's channeled the violence he once wielded into productivity, into creation. She places her hand on her stomach, feeling the subtle swell there that speaks of life growing where before there was only death and loss. She hasn't told him yet, wants to savor the secret a little longer, wants to be certain this fragile hope will hold. When he looks up and catches her watching, he smiles, a real smile, unguarded and genuine in ways she once thought impossible for a man carrying his burdens. She crosses the yard and takes his hand, presses it against her belly where new life quickens, and watches understanding dawn in his eyes like sunrise after the longest night. We survived, she says simply, against all reason and odds and every force that tried to destroy us. We survived and made something beautiful from the ruins. His tears fall onto their joined hands, but they're different tears than the ones she's seen him cry before. These aren't grief or guilt or despair. These are gratitude and wonder, and the recognition that sometimes, rarely, impossibly, love emerges from the absolute worst circumstances and refuses to be extinguished. May love be what remains when the world ends, Astrid whispers, echoing words she once heard in prayers but understanding them now through experience instead of doctrine. May it be stronger than hate, more enduring than vengeance, the only thing that truly survives when everything else burns away. And there, in the morning light with the past behind them and the future uncertain but chosen, two people who should have been enemies hold each other and the life growing between them and dare to believe that redemption might be real after all. So tell me, what would you have done in Astrid's place? When the blade was in your hand and revenge was just one thrust away, could you have chosen mercy over justice? Could you have looked past the blood on his hands to see the broken man beneath? Or would the weight of your grief have been too heavy to carry toward anything but destruction? We like to think we know what we'd do in moments like these, that our moral compass points true north even in the darkest storms. But the truth Astrid discovered is far more complicated. Sometimes the people who hurt us most are themselves victims of forces neither of us fully understood. Sometimes choosing love over hate isn't weakness. It's the bravest act of rebellion against a world that profits from our endless cycles of vengeance. This story isn't just about a nun and a warrior in medieval times. It's about every one of us carrying wounds we didn't ask for, guilt we can't wash away, and the impossible choice between becoming what hurt us or daring to build something different from the ruins. Astrid and Leif didn't erase their pasts. They couldn't. The blood spilled doesn't unspill. The dead don't return. But they chose to stop adding to the pile of bodies, to let their story end in life instead of more death. And maybe that's the only redemption any of us ever really get. Not the erasure of our sins, but the daily choice to do better with whatever broken pieces we're left holding. If this story moved you, if it made you question what justice really means, or challenged how you think about forgiveness and redemption, do me a favor. Hit that like button, share this with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe so you don't miss the next story that might change how you see the world. Because stories like these matter. They remind us that we're all more complicated than villain or victim, that love can grow in the most impossible soil, and that sometimes the greatest act of courage is choosing not to become the monster that the world tried to make us. Thank you for listening, for feeling, for being here. Until next time, may you find your own path through the ruins toward something worth building.